So now let's connect to INAV and go to the ports tab and see what's there. This is where you can define what your UARTs are connected to, all your ports in your flight controller. If you recall from a previous video, looking at my Talon GT Rebel, I have the Crossfire receiver connected to UART 2. Now by default, it looks like this is set up for serial RX, which is what we want. And it's running at 115,200 bits per second. And that's really all I need to do to set up for Crossfire to work on the UART. There's really nothing I have to change there. Now, the other thing was the GPS. The GPS is on UART 4. Now, what I have to do for that is go down here and select the GPS sensor. Everything else can just remain as it is because I don't really have anything else connected. So I can just save and reboot, and we're done with the ports tab, actually. But while I'm here, instead of moving on to the next tab, I'm going to go ahead and set up the GPS, which actually is in the next tab. So that's convenient. Let's go to the Configuration tab. Now, if you look at the data sheet for your particular flight controller, you can determine what accelerometer it has on board and what barometer it has. So if I want to make sure what I have, I will want to go to the Maytech website. I actually have the 405 WMN, which is the mini wing. So if we go to the Maytech F405 WMN page, you can see it even tells you right here up front. So the IMU is an ICM 82688P, the barometer is an SPL 06. So if we go back over to the configurator, we want to set the appropriate accelerometer. So in this case, the accelerometer is the ICM 42688, which I'm not seeing. So I don't know if I need that to be 4265E or what is it, 42605. I'm not really sure, but the barometer is SPL06. So ICM 42688. I don't actually see that on there, but 42605 seems close. So I'm going to leave it with the default settings and hope that that's working. But we've been through the calibration, and we could see in setup that when you move the aircraft, it works. So it's working. So we shouldn't have to do anything there. But this is a sidetrack from the GPS. Now there's a number of other things we want to configure in here, but since I just enabled the GPS in the ports tab, I'd like to continue with that stage, and then we can come back and focus on everything else. So to enable GPS, we have to turn this option on. So this enables GPS for navigation and telemetry. So this is where you'll get all your telemetry data and your navigation options for automated flying and all that good stuff. So once that's set, I'm going to save and reboot because there's a couple other things we want to look at for GPS. So let's jump ahead to the GPS tab. You can see now up here there's an indicator that says GPS, and it's lit up blue. That means we have good communication, that the flight controller is talking to the GPS. And this GPS, operates on the uBlocks 7 protocol, I believe. GPS for navigation and telemetry is also configurable here. So if I change it here, it'll change it in configuration. I think this is a recent addition. And there's also some settings here for GPS satellites. And if I want to use the Galileo satellites, if my GPS supports that, I can enable this. Now, I won't get deep into the GPS stuff, but even though there's a number of satellites you can choose here, most GPSs do not support all of them at once. So if you select an invalid configuration here and you save and reboot, it'll come up and everything will be reset. You'll wonder what's going on. That's because your GPS doesn't allow certain configurations. So you really have to play with this to see if it works. And also, I like to set my offset time zone to -700 for Arizona because that's where I am. And if I save and reboot, it should reopen the GPS tab. And now you can see that the settings stuck, so it looks like we're good. And it looks like we're getting some satellites. I have 6 satellites. It's giving me my longitude and latitude, so now you know where I live. And it shows up in the map even, so it'll show you your location. Then all these GPS options are available in the on-screen display. I'm actually not going to go there yet, so just understand that now that your GPS is configured and you have connectivity, you're good to go with the GPS. So let's go back to the configuration and finish that tab. So we got the accelerometer. We're not using a magnetometer. This particular GPS does not have a magnetometer. You can use a magnetometer. INAV, prior to version 6, I believe, they actually suggest that you don't use a compass unless you are flying a quad. In that case, you need a compass. But for a fixed wing, you don't need a compass. And I don't have one. I don't use it. You might get more accurate readings if you do use one nowadays in INAV 7. But I don't know. I could put another GPS in there that's got a compass in it and use that and try it out. But so far, I haven't needed one, and I've flown out to nearly 15 miles. I2C, or I2C, is that bus for serial connectivity to certain devices, like temperature control or temperature sensors and whatnot, analog airspeed. I think even the compass is driven off of the I2C bus. This, I'm just leaving that to the default 400K. You can switch it to 800 kilohertz if the connected hardware allows it. I don't know if my temperature sensor allows it. I have a temperature sensor. So I'm just going to leave that at 400 kilohertz. The enable CPU-based serial ports, if you recall from an earlier video, there is a soft serial port that is like a UART, but it's implemented in the firmware. It's not a hardware implementation. This is what enables that port. So that port won't even show up, and we never saw it in the mixer or the outputs because this was not enabled. And we have no use for it. I've only used 2 UARTs. I've got a bunch of them available if I need, so I don't need an additional serial port. I can leave that off. We just enabled the GPS. Now the telemetry output sends telemetry output to where? I don't know. But I have that enabled so I can receive telemetry. I'm assuming that'll send it through Crossfire, and that's what I get on my Crossfire transceiver. Again, if you have reversible motors, you can enable that here. Analog RSSI input, if you're utilizing that, which I'm not, you can enable that. Multicolor RGB LED strip support. INAV has support for these programmable LED strips. I'm not using one yet, but I'm going to use that in the future at some point. I do not have an OLED screen display. You can get a little display that shows, I don't know actually what it shows on it. Maybe you can configure it. I don't know. I haven't used it. I haven't looked at it. If you want to explore that, there it is. It's just like a little LCD, well, LED, OLED display. A lot of flight controllers, at least from Maytech, come with a flight data recorder. There's a slot for an SD card that you can insert into the flight controller itself. And if you have black box flight data recorder enabled, it will utilize that and it'll record your data. So if something happens to your airplane and it goes down, you can recover that data and load it into a tool to visualize what happened. We've already enabled motor and servo output. It's like some of these enable options are scattered throughout other tabs, as we've already seen. So we can enable the motor and servo output here just as well. I'm not using SPI, so I'm skipping that. I want OSD, on-screen display, because I want the information in my goggles. So that's on. Permanently enable air mode. I'm not going to really get into that, but it's good to just leave that on. And I also like to enable auto launch so that I can use that feature if I want to. As soon as you arm your plane, it goes into an auto launch mode, and you can cancel that at any time by moving the sticks if you want to do a manual launch. So it's handy to have that if you want to use it, and you can always override it if you don't. So turn that on. Profile selection with TX stick command. So INAV has what's called stick commands where you can move your sticks on your transmitter to certain extremes. So by having this selected, you can use a particular motion on your sticks to select the profile. And I don't know if that refers to just the battery profile or the PID profile or mixer profile, or if there's different stick commands you can use for each one. It's not real clear, and they don't have a little help icon here. So kind of in the dark on that one. Throttle voltage compensation, you can enable that for INAV to estimate your battery voltage sag, because if you hit a high current in your batteries, it's got some internal resistance, your voltage will sag. This will kind of compensate for that in the display. It says there automatically compensate for the voltage drop in the battery's discharge to keep thrust constant relative to throttle. Okay, so that's something a little different. So it's actually keeping the thrust constant throttle depending on the battery voltage. So maybe you want to enable that. I haven't done that, so I don't know. Up to you. Automatic battery profile selection. That's useful if you have different battery voltages, like you stick a 4S pack in or a 6S pack. It can detect whether you're putting in a 4S or 6S pack and then automatically select your battery profile. I'm only flying with 4S packs, 4S 2P. I might put a 4S 3P in this, but I've just got a bunch of 4S batteries, so I don't really need this profile selection. But I have different capacities of the same batteries, so I have to manually select the profile that I want. And I can define up to 3 profiles in here. I will define 2 because I have 2 different battery capacities that I'm using. Now this option I kind of mentioned a little bit ago on the Outputs tab. This you can set to continuously trim servos on fixed wing. And what that does is that it constantly monitors your inputs and your servo and your flight characteristics to set your servo center trims. So I was mentioning in the previous tab, or the Outputs tab, that your servo endpoints, min, max, and center point may change after a flight if you've got the auto trim set up. So this continuously trim servos on fixed wing option will modify those settings as you fly. And you can turn it off later if you're happy with the settings, but sometimes they can change depending on your flying conditions. Like if you're flying at high altitude, you have a higher angle of attack. Whatever, it can change, it can fluctuate during flight. So I like to just always have it turned on. And now if I save and reboot, I have saved the options that I have enabled. Also, one thing to keep in mind with continuously trimmed servos on fixed wing, there is a step that we'll look at later on for auto-tuning your aircraft. And after you land, you will want to save the settings after you've automatically tuned the flight. With this option turned on, your settings will be saved automatically when you disarm. If you were to turn this off, they would not automatically save, and you'd have to use a stick command to save them, which I think is down left, down right on your opposing sticks. So over here on this side, here is where you would calibrate your voltage and current sensors. I'm not going to do this right now. There's a whole process to go through, a procedure to do that. But this will get you accurate readings in your voltage up here, which is now reading 0.29 volts. I'm not sure where that's coming from. And your current sensor, which is a little more involved in setting that up to get that calibrated accurately. And just as a sneak peek, it's useful if you have a power meter to hook in line between your battery and the flight controller so that you can get these readings that you need in order to calibrate this setting. So here's a set of input fields that are shaded, and I happen to know these are associated with the battery profile. So this is where you can define your battery profile. I always use 4S, so I can put that in here, but it can automatically detect that if it's set to 0. So if I put 4 in there, I can do that. Maximum cell voltage for cell count detection. I didn't enable cell detection automatic battery profile, so that doesn't really apply to me, but I just leave it at the default there. My lithium ion batteries can drop to a minimum of 2.5 volts. I don't like to go below 3.2, but I will set this minimum cell voltage to 3, and then I will set this warning cell voltage to 3.2. So once I get down to 3.2, I want to maybe consider landing my airplane. Now, as far as battery capacity unit, I want milliamp hours. You can also select milliwatt hours. Milliwatt hours may be more useful to you depending on how you're measuring your capacity or your power usage. And I have a 7,000 milliamp hour pack, which is a 2P pack, which is a combination of two 3,000 milliamp hour batteries. That's their rating. Their typical capacity, usable capacity, is 3,500 milliamp hour batteries. Their typical usable capacity is somewhere around 3,450. So 3,450 times 2 is not quite 7,000. So I put 6,900 milliamp hours is my capacity. Now I also have another battery that's only 6,000 milliamp hours. For there I would probably put like 5,800. I like to set a warning threshold, which will make your OSD indicator flash if you have your battery capacity displayed in your OSD, which I like to do. So battery capacity remaining, I like to get that flashing at, 15%, and I consider 10% critical. That's pretty critical as far as I'm concerned. So now I've got these settings set up the way I like. So I'm going to save that and let it reboot one more time. And now you can see if I go up here and change the battery profile to profile 2, that's going to reload. And now there's no settings here. I don't see those settings I just put in because those are back on battery profile 1. So what I could do is come in here and set up my other profile. I can set the same values that I want here. I don't know why. 4.2. Yeah. And my capacity here is more like 5,800. And again, maybe I'll put 20% there and 15% for this one. So now I have two battery profiles. And later on down the road, when we get deeper into this, I can show you the stick commands to change the battery profile before a flight. Half the time I don't remember to even do that. I'm going to go switch it back to profile 1, and that will stick. So hopefully if I disconnect and I reconnect, come into the configuration, it'll still be set to battery profile 1. Okay, so that wraps up the configuration for the time being. So let's go ahead and remember to disconnect, and then we can move on from here.